Been through hell and high water, you and me. Fact is, you know me better than anyone else does. Actually, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you.
A while ago, CD Projekt Red released a video commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Witcher series, a short clip in which Geralt, the series protagonist, was looking back at his adventures and thanking the fans for their support throughout the years, which was quite touching to be honest. Rarely in the industry do we see such success stories when a small studio, starting out with a flawed yet unique middle market title, over time makes it to the AAA segment with a huge open world epic that can rival the releases of industry mainstays like Bethesda or BioWare. And while Witcher 3 Wild Hunt is a great game that deserves all the praise and the accolades it gets, from a broader perspective, some of the elements that made the series debut so memorable somehow didn't make it to the Wild Hunt. Let's look at what made the first game so good and what was missing from Witcher 3, the good elements that the series has lost throughout the years. The plot of the first Witcher game focused on the mystery surrounding the Salamander gang and the conflict between the fanatic Order of the Flaming Rose and the non-human skeletal terrorists. Even though we had to pick sides, mostly choosing whether we side with the Order or the Elvish group, there was also a third option most of the time, remaining neutral, which often was the worst choice. The writers of The Witcher perfectly got what the books were about. There were no good choices, no black and white contrast, only lesser evil and moral shades of grey, and that was greatly reflected in the game choices. Siding with either of the groups, while awarding us with certain profits and options, made it harder to deal with the other, and vice versa. And then there was neutrality, the worst possible option, which, while the closest to the Witcher ideals of not getting involved and not picking sides, made people overall hate us, or at the very least, treat us poorly. Why was the option so interesting? Well, from a gameplay perspective, it kinda sucked, but it made a lot of sense within the context of the universe. It's a dark fantasy world, and Witchers, while taking care of the filth that plague the common people, they aren't fantasy heroes or virtuous saviors. They're the fantasy garbage men of this universe, whom the troubled reach out to, not because they want to, but because they are the last viable option. Did the writers forget about being neutral, or did they cut that element down as a symptom of dumbing down the games? Well, none of the above, to be honest. As the scope and scale of the games changed, so did Geralt's moral compass. It's similar to how the hero has changed over the course of the saga. In the short stories, he is in fact this neutral Lone Ranger archetype with no home or a clear goal in life, a drifter if you will. Having been raised by the Witchers and being an outcast to society, our hero remains neutral. The world doesn't accept him, and in return, he doesn't want to be a part of it, and even if he did, he wouldn't fit in. Over time, however, Geralt changes from a lone wolf to a more heroic father figure, although some of the changes start in the short stories themselves. Having something that resembles a family with Ciri and Yen, Geralt can't remain neutral, he has something to fight for. The disappearance of the neutral option makes sense from a story perspective, as the Wild Hunt is much more epic and the stakes more personal to Geralt. Still, it would be nice to see more of it in the future of the franchise. One of the biggest selling points of the Witcher universe is the dark fantasy aesthetic. The knights and princesses of this fantasy world aren't by any means paragons. The world itself is ugly and full of strife and racism, and the monsters themselves tend to have a higher moral standard than some humans. Wild Hunt played into those aspects as well, but it wasn't as gritty and as depressing as the first game or the source material, some would say. Sure, the northern kingdoms are torn apart by war, famine and other issues, but it isn't as gritty as the first game was. The darker atmosphere of Witcher 1 was largely due to the creation of the city of Vizima, or rather the fact that we were stuck there for a larger part of the game. Many gamers were getting fed up with the city at some point due to a rather annoying backtracking, a lack of fast travel and the sheer repetitiveness of the task we were given, but it was those reasons that partially helped make the game world more hostile and overwhelming. In the Wild Hunt, we have three bigger areas: Novigrad, Velen, and the later unlockable Skellige region. While all of those have been exceptionally crafted, they are fun to explore and looked really good, they aren't by any means depressing, they are in fact welcoming. It's not like Wild Hunt isn't dark, mind you. Characters commit suicide, they're burnt alive, maimed and murdered in other horrible ways, but that sort of darkness is most of the time tied directly to the story set pieces and not exploration. In the Wild Hunt, you can always mount a horse and ride away to explore and get this sense of freedom that comes with the sandbox world. In the first game, however, you are in a way a prisoner and you can't look away. One of the elements of the world of the first Witcher that made it so compelling was the inclusion of Slavic themes. Certain traditions, monsters, and the overall atmosphere were a breath of fresh air after dozens of RPGs that expanded upon Anglo-Saxon high fantasy stemming from the works of writers such as Tolkien, for example. It was one of the reasons why the Polish audience loved the game so much, and why it was so interesting to the audience abroad, at least those that could stomach the faults and mediocrity of it. One of the biggest faults of the Wild Hunt, according to some hardcore fans, was the lack of such elements in the third game, apart from a few references to Slavic myths or unique monsters like the botchling. Separation from the Slavic roots of The Witcher didn't happen overnight. It all started back in Witcher 2: Assassins of Kings, which, while more polished and improved in terms of gameplay, was also more appealing to a wider audience. It was more Western. The first town we got to explore, Flotsam, was nothing like the villages and smaller towns of the first game. It seemed more bland and uninspired in comparison, like a typical small village in any other medieval RPG game. And you can say that about many towns in the third game that focus more on quantity instead of quality. Relying on well-known fantasy tropes and archetypes certainly made for a more appealing game, but it sacrificed one of The Witcher's greatest strengths in return, its uniqueness. Wild Hunt certainly has some unique locations and set pieces, but it goes without saying that the artistic direction of the game itself was far from the one seen in the studio's debut. One of the symptoms of that shift was the inclusion of Skellige, which, while probably the most original region in the game, was greatly inspired by Nordic themes and didn't seem to fit well in a Witcher game, even though it was mentioned in the novels a couple of times. The unslavicness of the core game was made up for in the Hearts of Stone expansion, which was full of references to Polish legends, traditions, and folklore. And it is precisely that expansion that gets the spirit of The Witcher more than the entirety of the Wild Hunt itself, it seems. The main quest is inspired by a certain theme, and even the side quests, most of the time, are in some way connected to the main plot. In that particular aspect, Hearts of Stone resembles probably the best part of the first Witcher, the fourth act of the game, which many fans sadly haven't seen because they got bored with the game by then. After receiving a few brief mentions and a subplot in The Lady of the Lake, the so-called Wild Hunt, a group of elvish conquerors from a different dimension, became the main baddies of Witcher 3. Apart from Eredin, who is quite charismatic, most of his group seems like edgy Witch King knockoffs who are there just to look cool and menacing, but don't have much to offer apart from that. Even though we get to hunt one of them in the main story, which in itself is a wasted opportunity for some character exposition. Ironically, Wild Hunt isn't so much about the titular group, but is rather about Geralt and Ciri and the hardships their relationship has to endure. The villains are there just to be bad and aren't as fleshed out as they should be, at least not like the villain of the first game was. Enter Jacques de Aldersberg, the Grand Master of the Order of the Flaming Rose and the secret main antagonist of the first game. Tracking Azor Javed, we soon learned that the leader of the Salamander was but a pawn of a much greater adversary. Jacques wants to overthrow Foltest and purge all the non-humans in his greater plan for the future of the Northern Kingdoms. We fought similar characters before, but what makes him so compelling is his backstory, which makes us empathize with him much more. Throughout the game, the writers often hint that Jacques is in fact Alvin, the young boy we look after in some parts of the game. Alvin, just like Ciri, is a source, a being with unique magic powers, and it is those powers that allow him, amongst other things, to jump across time and space. Connecting the hints scattered throughout the game, we can learn that Jacques is the future version of Alvin, who got lost in time and was traumatized by non-humans. What is so memorable here is the sheer contrast. Alvin's innocence and childish enthusiasm contrasted with Jacques' ruthlessness and prejudices. The Grand Master isn't entirely evil, he's a troubled man who wants to save the world in his own way, but became a radical because of his experiences. And that is one of the greatest strengths of the first Witcher that seems to have been forgotten over time. A creation of a compelling villain who is but a product of this dark world with no clear line dividing good from evil. All in all, the first Witcher game was a flawed title, but it doesn't mean some of its elements shouldn't be praised and deconstructed years after the release. And when it comes to Witcher 3, well, criticizing a great game is part of contemplating it, and it's not like we hate the Wild Hunt, but some of its elements certainly could have been much better if the writers stuck to the roots of the franchise. Let us know what you think in the comment section below. Thanks for watching, I'll see you soon, and sorry you've been gone for such a long time.